Noah had always been the kind of dedicated man. At 35, with an understanding wife and an 8-year-old son, Noah did his best to provide a comfortable life for his family. He worked as an analyst in an office in the city center where deadlines were tight and the environment was stressful. Still, he never complained. With his subtle smile and rare patience, Noah was respected by his colleagues. Among them was Luna, a young attendant who had recently started working there. Always polite, Noah was one of the few people who really stopped to listen to her, asking how she was doing and praising her effort to quickly learn the tasks. That night, Noah stayed late at the office. He needed to finalize an important spreadsheet while Luna organized documents in the next room. The company was almost empty, and the silence was broken only by the sound of keys and shuffling papers. When Luna appeared at his office door, Noah looked at the clock and realized it was almost midnight. She seemed hesitant, clutching her purse tightly. "Noah, you live near Central Avenue, don't you? My bus stopped running, and I'm afraid to walk home alone. Could you give me a ride?" she asked with a timid voice. Noah hesitated for a moment, thinking about the time and his family waiting for him, but ended up agreeing. "Sure, Luna. I won't let you walk around at this hour. Come on, I'll get my things and take you home safely." The next day, Noah didn't return home, leaving the house enveloped in an eerie and uncomfortable silence. Noah's wife tried to stay calm, convincing herself that maybe he had stayed at work late and slept in a hotel to avoid driving tired. However, as the hours passed, this justification seemed increasingly fragile. Noah's 13-year-old son, Jones, paced back and forth in the living room, restless. "Mom, did you try calling him? Why isn't he here yet? He never does this." Noah's wife, though trying to appear calm, couldn't hide the worry on her face. "Yes, Jones, I called, but he didn't answer. It could be that his phone ran out of battery or that he's still busy with something important at work." Jones sat down on the couch, forcefully crossing his arms. "But Mom, Dad always lets us know when he's going to be late. He would never be out for this long without giving us any news." The boy's eyes were full of concern, and his voice, normally firm and full of energy, now sounded almost like a whisper. His mother sighed, feeling a weight accumulating in her chest. "I know, dear, I know, it's strange, but we need to trust that he's okay. Let's wait a little longer before jumping to conclusions." Although she wanted to reassure her son, each word seemed forced, as if she were trying to convince herself that Noah was fine. Suddenly, while they both remained in the living room, they heard the sound of tires screeching abruptly outside. Jones ran to the window, and his mother followed close behind, both with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. When they looked out onto the street, what they saw left them frozen. 2 police cars were parked in front of the house, lights flashing, illuminating the facade. Noah was being led by 2 uniformed officers, handcuffed, and with an expression that mixed confusion and despair. "Mom, it's Dad!" Jones exclaimed, his voice trembling. His eyes widened and he pressed his hands against the glass, unable to comprehend what was happening. Noah's wife brought her hands to her mouth, shocked. "My God, what's going on? Why are they taking Noah?" Her voice failed and her heart raced in her chest. She hurriedly opened the door, but one of the officers had already put Noah in the patrol car. Before she could approach, the other officer turned to her, his tone firm. "Ma'am, your husband is being arrested on suspicion of homicide. He will be taken in for questioning." The words hit her like a punch, leaving her breathless. "Homicide? That's impossible. There must be some mistake," she said, but the officer didn't respond and got into the car. Jones looked at his mother, desperately seeking some explanation. "Mum, what do they mean by that? Dad would never hurt anyone. They can't be serious." The boy seemed on the verge of tears, but his expression showed more confusion than sadness. His mother pulled him close, embracing him as she watched the patrol car drive away. Tears began to stream down her face, though she tried to maintain a strong posture. "I don't know, Jones. I don't know, but we'll find out the truth. Your father wouldn't do anything like that, I know it." As the police car disappeared down the street, the mother and son stood at the front door, paralyzed, trying to process what had just happened. The silence that remained was heavy, filled only by the sound of the wind and the tumultuous thoughts that crossed their minds. They knew that this moment marked the beginning of something dark, something that would forever change the life of their family. The shock of what they had witnessed would not be easily overcome, and the questions that arose seemed to have no immediate answers. We will go back to the previous night to explain what happened. On that fateful night, when Noah offered Luna a ride, he would never have imagined the horror that was to come. It was late, and the silence of the deserted streets was interrupted only by the sound of the car's engine and the light conversation between the two of them. Noah was driving calmly, while Luna, sitting in the passenger seat, talked about the challenges at work and how she was trying to balance her professional life with her studies. "I really appreciate this, Noah. I don't know what I would do if I had to walk home alone tonight." "You're an angel," Luna said with a sincere smile. Noah returned with a nod and a discreet smile. "It's nothing, Luna. It's dangerous to walk alone at this hour. I'm happy to help." The journey seemed peaceful, but there was something in the air that Noah couldn't identify, an uncomfortable feeling that something was out of place. He looked in the rearview mirror several times, thinking he might be being followed, but saw nothing but empty streets and shadows cast by the feeble public lighting. When they finally arrived at Luna's house, she pointed to the sidewalk in front of it. "You can stop there, Noah. Thank you again for everything," she said, as she grabbed her bag and prepared to get out of the car. Noah pulled the car up close to the gate of Luna's small house, which was plunged into the shadows, except for a faint light on the porch. He turned off the engine and waited as Luna got out. "Take care, Luna. Let me know if you need anything," he said, worried, but without knowing the exact reason. "Don't worry, Noah. Good night and see you tomorrow," replied Luna, waving before heading to the gate. However, before she could open the door, the silence of the night was shattered by a deafening sound. Out of nowhere, a hooded man emerged from the shadows beside the house, holding a gun. Noah saw the metallic glint even before he heard the shot. "Luna, watch out!" he shouted, but it was too late. The hooded man began firing, and the sound of gunshots echoed through the empty street like an explosion tearing through the silence. Panic gripped Noah as Luna was hit, her body swaying with the impact of the bullets before falling lifeless to the ground. A desperate scream escaped his lips as blood began to spread rapidly across the ground. Noah, in shock, got out of the car immediately, running towards her as if every second was vital. "Luna! Oh God! Luna!" He knelt beside her, his mind trying to process the horrific scene he had just witnessed. Luna's blood was soaking her clothes as Noah pressed his hands against the wounds in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. "Please, hang on. I'll call for help," Noah said hurriedly, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He grabbed his phone, but his blood-stained hands made it difficult to handle. Sweat ran down his forehead as he tried to dial the emergency number, but his fingers seemed unable to respond to his urgency. "Don't leave me, Luna. Please stay with me," he repeated, almost pleading as he looked at her face, which was already starting to lose color. Luna tried to speak, her trembling, blood-stained lips, but her voice was weak, almost inaudible. "Noah, why?" she whispered, her eyes starting to lose focus as if searching for answers he didn't have. Noah shook his head frantically, tears forming in his eyes. "I don't know, Luna. Please, stay with me. You'll be okay." "I promise," he said. But the gravity of the situation was clear. The blood wouldn't stop flowing, and Luna was no longer able to keep her eyes open. Noah felt the despair growing inside him like an uncontrollable wave, threatening to engulf him. As Noah tried to save Luna, the hooded figure disappeared into the darkness without a trace, the sound of hurried footsteps echoing down the street. Noah looked around, desperate, trying to locate where the man had gone, but he was already far away, vanishing like a shadow in the night. His breathing was panting, and fear paralyzed him, even as he tried to help Luna. It was then that a faint light illuminated the doorway of the house. An elderly woman appeared, her eyes wide as she saw the horrific scene before her. It was Susan, Luna's grandmother, who had heard the gunshots from inside the house and ran to see what was happening. Susan's eyes fixed on Noah, kneeling beside her granddaughter, his hands covered in blood. "What have you done to my granddaughter?" Susan shouted, her voice laden with despair and accusation. Her steps were quick toward the scene as she put her hands on her head, completely terrified by what she saw. Noah stood up quickly, trying to explain. I didn't do anything." A man appeared. He shot her. I was just trying to help," he said, the words stumbling out, desperate for her to believe him. But Susan, taken over by pain and confusion, didn't want to listen. "You killed my Luna. I saw you here." "You're the one to blame," Susan shouted, her voice broken by pain but filled with an unrelenting conviction. Her words were like a hammer pounding repeatedly, each syllable sinking Noah's mind deeper into an abyss of despair. She advanced toward him, her steps firm in contrast with the tears streaming down her wrinkled face, as if she wanted to confront him with the same force as her pain. Noah, paralyzed for an instant, instinctively raised his hands, his fingers still stained with Luna's blood, as if he could somehow protect himself from a guilt that wasn't his. He slowly backed away, his voice trembling and desperate. "No, it wasn't like that. I swear, I just brought Luna here. I would never do something like that," he repeated, but his justification seemed insignificant in the face of Susan's devastation. Susan's expression didn't change. It was a mixture of raw pain and fury, as if her world had been destroyed in seconds, and Noah was the only one responsible for it. "You think I'm going to believe you? I saw you. I saw you beside her, with your hands full of my granddaughter's blood," she shouted again, her voice growing higher with each word. Noah felt his throat dry, the words piling up in his mind, but none seemed enough to break Susan's certainty. Her scream echoed down the deserted street, turning the silence into a courtroom where Noah was the only defendant, and she, the judge. Panic gripped Noah like an electric current running through his body. He looked at his blood-stained hands, incriminating evidence that no explanation seemed capable of erasing. The sirens in the distance grew louder, like an imminent warning that time was running out. Every second seemed compressed, and Noah felt suffocated by the urgency of making a decision. He knew that in that situation, no one would believe him. He was the last person seen with Luna, and the scene Susan had witnessed was too incriminating to be contested. The truth no longer mattered. What mattered were appearances, and they condemned him mercilessly. "I need to get out of here," Noah thought, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at Susan one last time. Her eyes were red, fixed on him, filled with unbearable pain. She was still shouting, but the words were starting to blend in his mind, as if the world around him was unraveling. He averted his gaze to Luna, who lay motionless on the ground, surrounded by a pool of blood that seemed to grow with every passing second. The sight was unbearable, a scene he knew would be etched in his memory forever. He wanted to help. He wanted to explain, but the words seemed useless, and the growing sound of sirens pushed him away. "I'm sorry," Noah muttered, more to himself than to Susan or Luna, before turning his back and starting to run. Each step seemed weighed down by a burden that pulled him back, but the survival instinct spoke louder. He knew that running away was the worst decision, but at that moment he couldn't think of any other alternative. His footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, mingled with the distant sound of sirens that grew louder and louder. The night air seemed heavier, making it difficult to breathe, while his heart beat so fast that he felt it could explode at any moment. The sound of sirens seemed to be everywhere at once, as if the city itself was turning against him. Noah turned the corner and entered a darker street, trying to hide. His legs seemed to work on autopilot, while his mind was stuck in a loop of chaotic thoughts. Why did this happen? Why me? Who would do such a thing to Luna? The image of her falling to the ground, her eyes wide with terror, repeated in his mind like a movie he couldn't stop watching. The blood, the sound of gunshots, Susan's screams, everything blended into an unbearable chaos. Noah knew his life would never be the same again. Every second of that night seemed to plunge a knife deeper into his mind, leaving scars that he knew would never be erased. He had not only lost Luna in a tragic and brutal way, but was now seen as responsible for her death. The image of her lifeless body, surrounded by a pool of blood, continued to replay in his mind like a frozen photograph in time. Even knowing he was innocent, the mere idea of proving it seemed impossible. How could he convince a world that had already passed its judgment? The weight of Susan's accusations echoed in his mind like a hammer, each word a blow that pushed him further away from his reality and into a nightmare he didn't know how to wake up from. He felt like he was drowning in an ocean of uncertainties, where the truth seemed a distant island, forever out of reach. What tormented him most was the fact that, at that moment, he had no answers, only questions. Who was the man who attacked Luna? Why her? And why had he been thrown into the center of it all? The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, almost suffocating. With every attempt to organize his thoughts, Susan's words would resurface, piercing his mind like an endless scream. "You killed my granddaughter." It wasn't just an accusation, it was a verdict. And at that moment, Noah felt like no one in the world was willing to hear his side of the story. The words kept hammering incessantly, louder and louder, more and more intense, as if they wanted to drown out anything else he tried to think. Noah knew that, even before explaining himself, the world had already turned against him. He was guilty in everyone's eyes, and that was enough to condemn him. It didn't matter that he was a hard-working man, a devoted husband, a loving father. None of that mattered in the face of the scenario that unfolded that night. The blood-stained hands, Luna's body at his feet, and Susan, her eyes filled with pain and anger, pointing at him as the killer. Everything conspired against him, and the weight of the unjust judgment seemed to crush any hope of redemption. He felt trapped in an invisible web, tightening around him, suffocating him, restricting his movements, his options, his very identity. He was no longer the Noah he knew, the man who dedicated his life to working hard to provide the best for his family. He was no longer the Noah who could come home after a tiring day, sit with his wife, and play with his son. From that moment on, all of that seemed lost. He was no longer an ordinary man trying to take care of his family. Now he was a fugitive, a man whose hands were stained with guilt, even if there was no blood on his conscience. And that distinction, he knew, made no difference to the world. Fear consumed him completely. It wasn't just the fear of being arrested, of being convicted for something he didn't do. It was the fear of the unknown, of what was to come. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into a deep, dark abyss, unsure of where it would all end. Susan's words kept echoing, like a weight tied to his feet, pulling him deeper and deeper. "You killed my granddaughter." No matter how many times he repeated to himself that he was innocent, her voice always sounded louder, firmer, more convincing. Noah felt he had lost control over his own life. Everything he was, everything he believed in, had been shattered in a matter of minutes. And at the same time, something inside him refused to give up. He knew he would need to fight, but the fight wouldn't be just against the police, against Susan, or against public perception. It would be a fight against his own fears, against the guilt that, even though unfair, was starting to take root in his mind. Doubt whispered, "What if I had done something different? What if I hadn't given that ride? What if I had stopped the hooded man in time?" These questions gnawed at his sanity, making the weight of the situation even more unbearable. The night seemed endless for Noah. He wandered the deserted streets of the city, head down heavy steps, and thoughts jostling like a whirlwind. The biting cold of the night seemed to reflect the despair that consumed him. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hide something or someone, an accusing look, an invisible threat. Noah knew the city was looking for him, knew people had already condemned him without hearing his version of the facts. "I need to think. I need to prove I'm innocent. But how?" he whispered to himself, as if repeating those words would bring some clarity amid the chaos. But there were no answers, only questions. The sound of his own footsteps echoed through the street, intensifying the heavy silence around him. The fear of being caught at any moment kept him constantly alert, and he looked back repeatedly, even when there was no one around. Eventually, Noah found a dark, narrow and shadowy alley where he decided to hide. He leaned against the cold, damp wall, trying to catch his breath, while exhaustion finally began to overcome him. He looked at his hands, still stained with Luna's blood, and guilt hit him like a punch. "I should have done something. I could have stopped it," he thought, even though he knew those words were useless. The image of Luna lying on the ground, the light fading from her eyes, played relentlessly in his mind, a nightmare he knew he would never forget. He rubbed his hands on his pants, trying to wipe off the blood, but the stain seemed to only spread, a permanent reminder of the horror of that night. He wanted to cry, but the tears didn't come, perhaps blocked by adrenaline or the overwhelming terror of his new reality. As the night wore on, fatigue began to weigh on his body. The cold penetrated his skin, and he felt his muscles stiffen, but he couldn't afford to relax. Hunger began to bother him, but it was his least concern. Fear, that was unbearable. Every sound seemed amplified. A dog barking in the distance, the noise of a gate closing, or even the wind blowing through the alleys. Everything made him jump. He tried to organize his thoughts, find a way out, but his mind was as confused as his heart. Noah huddled in the corner of the alley, hugging his knees, trying to ignore the hard ground and the tears that finally began to roll down. Tomorrow I'll find a solution, he whispered, trying to convince himself that there was a future before closing his eyes and falling into a restless sleep. Noah was awakened the next morning by the unmistakable sound of footsteps and firm voices. He slowly opened his eyes, and the sunlight that illuminated the alley momentarily blinded him. "Wake up, Noah Carter. You're under arrest." The authoritative voice of a police officer cut through the air, making Noah jump up quickly, his heart racing. He saw 2 officers pointing guns at him, while a third handcuffed him with quick and precise movements. "No, wait! I didn't do anything," Noah shouted, but his protests were ignored. He tried to struggle, but the officers pushed him forward, forcing him to walk. The chill of the handcuffs on his wrists made him realize the gravity of what was happening. He looked around, hoping to see a familiar face, someone who could help him, but all he found was the indifference of those who already considered him guilty. The police station was cold and impersonal, with concrete walls that seemed to crush any hope of innocence. Noah was placed in a room that was too brightly lit, where 2 detectives were waiting for him. They stared at him with hard expressions, the kind of look that left no doubt about what they thought of him. One of the detectives placed a photo on the table, a picture of a gun. "Noah Carter, we found a gun registered in your name during the search of your home," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. Noah felt his stomach churn. He knew he had that gun, but it was just to protect his family. "Yes, I have a gun, but it's just for protection. I've never used it against anyone," he replied, trying to stay calm, although his voice was shaking. But the detectives were unshaken. "The gun that killed Luna Williams has the same characteristics as yours, model, caliber, everything. That's an awfully convenient coincidence, don't you think?" the detective retorted, raising an eyebrow. Noah felt his breathing quicken. He knew this looked incriminating, but he was innocent. "That doesn't prove anything. My gun is stored away, you can check," he insisted, his voice rising in desperation. But the detective only gave a cynical smile before replying, "We checked, and it's loaded with bullets identical to those used in the crime. There's no way out of this, Noah." The words fell on him like a crushing weight. Noah felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He knew he had never fired that gun, but how could he prove it? The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. He looked at the detectives, hoping to find some trace of compassion or doubt, but saw only indifference. It was as if they had already decided his fate even before questioning him. The following days were a sequence of humiliations and despair, where each moment seemed to tear away another piece of Noah's humanity. He was brought to trial so quickly that he barely had time to assimilate everything that was happening. It seemed that the world was running, determined to see him destroyed, while he remained trapped in a state of disbelief. The courtroom was packed, crammed with people who had come merely to witness his downfall. They were unfamiliar faces, but the looks they cast upon him were filled with revulsion, judgment, and even a morbid curiosity. The constant murmur of whispers filled the environment, words laden with disdain that seemed to pierce his mind like invisible knives. He tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Every time he raised his eyes, he encountered expressions of condemnation, as if he were a monster that everyone was eager to see fall. The evidence was presented flawlessly, as if they were pieces of a carefully assembled puzzle designed to incriminate him. Crime scene photographs were displayed, showing Luna lying amid the blood, and Noah could not help but avert his gaze. The image was unbearable, a brutal reminder of the tragedy he had failed to prevent. The gun found in his home was highlighted as the prosecution's main piece, accompanied by a forensic report that stated, with cruel precision, that the bullets that killed Luna were compatible with that weapon. But it was Susan's testimony that truly sealed his sentence in his heart. "I saw him with my granddaughter, and now she's dead. He's guilty," Susan shouted, her voice choked with tears, but laden with conviction. Noah felt as if each of her words was a sentence, a confirmation that his version of events would never be heard. He tried to defend himself, tried to explain what had happened that night, but it seemed that each of his phrases was absorbed by the void. The words he spoke, the truth he carried in his heart, seemed weak and insignificant in the face of the overwhelming weight of the evidence and Susan's pain. With every attempt to argue, he felt the jury's gaze harden even further, as if they were determined not to believe him. Deep down, Noah knew the case was already lost. He could see it in the judge's expression, in the incessant whispers of the audience, and even in the eyes of the lawyer who, though he had done his best, had failed to reverse the narrative constructed against him. The verdict was announced with a coldness that crushed any remaining shred of hope. Guilty of murder in the first degree, the judge declared, his firm voice reverberating through the courtroom. The sound of the gavel striking the table echoed like a death sentence, and Noah felt as if the air was ripped from his lungs. He looked around, dazed, hoping that someone would stand up, that a voice would say that this was all a mistake, but nothing happened. The judge's words were definitive, and the world around him seemed to close in. When he heard the final sentence, death by electric chair, Noah could barely react. He remained motionless, as if he had been petrified, as the gravity of those words seeped into his mind. The moment he was escorted out of the courtroom was the most devastating. The people who were there seemed satisfied, as if they had witnessed the conclusion of a spectacle. Susan was in the front row crying, but her eyes were fixed on Noah with an intensity he would never forget. It was as if she had finally found the justice she sought, but for Noah, that was the greatest injustice. He wanted to shout, to run to her and tell her he was not guilty, but the words wouldn't come out. His throat seemed stuck, and his legs were too weak to move. Each step he took, escorted by the guards, seemed to weigh a ton, as if he were walking towards the abyss. The emptiness Noah felt was absolute. It was as if the very essence of who he was had been torn away, leaving only a broken man, condemned for something he didn't do. Every memory of his former life, every smile from his son, every moment of happiness by his wife's side now seemed like a distant echo, something he would never be able to reach again. He was no longer Noah Carter, the loving father who worked tirelessly to support his family. He was no longer the devoted husband who did everything to see his wife happy, nor the hard-working and respected man in his job, whose integrity was admired by all around him. Now he was just a number, a condemned man awaiting the end, reduced to an existence where the only purpose was to wait for the inevitable. The idea that the world had decided to erase him was unbearable, but the reality surrounding him made everything even crueler. Noah was alone, immersed in an oppressive silence that weighed more than any chain. Each passing day was a constant reminder that his life as he knew it had ended. There was no future, only a suffocating present that kept him imprisoned in his own mind. All that remained was to wait for the end, an end that seemed to approach slowly, dragging with it a pain so deep and silent that sometimes he wondered if the electric chair would be a relief compared to the torment of living like a condemned and forgotten man. The day dawned gloomy, with grey clouds stretching across the sky as if nature itself mourned Noah's fate. For him, however, time no longer meant anything. The hours marked by the clock in his cell were only cruel reminders that the end was approaching. Sitting on the small wooden bench, he stared at the floor with hunched shoulders, as if the weight of the world was crushing him. The cell was cold, narrow and silent, but that silence was deafening. His thoughts consumed him, incessantly replaying the scenes that led him there. Luna falling, the blood on the floor, Susan's screams, the judge's words. He knew that this would be the last day of his life. When he heard the heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway, he rose slowly. There was nowhere to run, no way to fight. The end was here, and he needed to face it. The guards arrived with neutral, almost mechanical expressions, as if this were just another routine procedure. One of them nodded at Noah and said in a firm but emotionless voice, "It's time, Noah Carter. Prepare yourself." The words fell like a final sentence, though the sentence had been given weeks ago. Noah didn't respond. He merely nodded slightly, a resigned gesture of someone who had already lost all battles. The iron door opened with a loud creak, and he was led down the hallway, his hands cuffed and his feet heavy, dragging as if each step was a struggle against gravity. The sound of the guards' boots reverberated, filling the empty space around them. Noah tried to breathe deeply, but the air seemed heavy, as if the very environment was against him. When he reached the execution chamber, the atmosphere seemed even colder and more impersonal than he had imagined. Bright lights illuminated the center of the room, highlighting the electric chair that awaited him. The sight of the chair sent a shiver down his spine, and he felt his knees weaken, but he forced himself to continue. The chair was simple, functional, but to him it seemed a grotesque symbol of the condemnation he didn't deserve. The guards led him to it, and he sat down with rigid, almost automatic movements, as if his body was disconnected from his mind. His handcuffs were removed only so that his arms and legs could be firmly secured to the chair's supports. Each tightened strap felt like a definitive sentence, a statement that there was no escape. "Stay still and don't move," one of the guards said as he adjusted the last strap. Noah raised his eyes and saw, on the other side of a glass partition, his wife and children. The impact of that sight was devastating. His wife's face was wet with tears, her shoulders shaking as she tried to contain her despair. His children, still so young, looked at him with expressions of fear and confusion. They didn't understand why this was happening. They only knew they were losing their father. Noah felt a wave of pain surge through him, more intense than anything he had ever experienced. He wanted to say something, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. "I'm sorry," he murmured, but he knew they couldn't hear him. He wanted to ask for forgiveness, to tell them he loved them, but all he could do was stare at them, trying to etch every detail of their faces into his memory. One of the prison officials approached, holding a paper, and began to explain the procedure, in a monotonous, almost callous voice. "Noah Carter, you have been sentenced to death for first-degree murder. Your execution will be swift and painless. The electric shock will interrupt the functions of your heart within seconds. There is no need to worry." The words were as cold as the metal of the chair, and Noah felt his stomach churn. How could someone say something like that with such nonchalance? He didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on his family, absorbing every second of that moment. The pain in his wife's eyes was almost unbearable, but he knew he needed to face it, even if it was the last act of courage he could offer. The guards placed the electrodes on his head with firm movements, carefully adjusting the metal cap, but with no gentleness or humanity. Noah felt the weight of the object pressing against his skin, the cold seeping deep, as if the metal wanted to merge with his soul. Every movement the guards made seemed amplified, the sounds echoing oppressively in the silent room. He heard the snap of the buckles being tightened, the creak of the straps being pulled tight around his body, and every sound seemed an inevitable prelude to his death. He tried to control his breathing, but the air seemed thicker with each passing second, as the tension in the room became almost palpable. Noah was motionless, but inside his mind was seething, struggling against the cruel reality that surrounded him. He closed his eyes as he felt the straps binding his arms and legs, as if he were being consumed by the chair itself, swallowed by a faceless monster that symbolized the final condemnation. His mind began to drift away from that place, seeking refuge in the memories of a life that now seemed to belong to someone else. He remembered the day he held his first child in his arms, feeling the warmth and fragility of that tiny body as tears of joy streamed down his face. He recalled his wife's radiant smile at the altar when they exchanged vows of eternal love, a love that seemed unshakable in the face of any adversity. Images of sunny Sundays at the park surfaced, the laughter of his children echoing as they ran and played without a care. For a brief moment, he almost felt the smell of the grass and the warmth of the sun on his skin. But these happy memories were quickly crushed by the shadows of the present. He saw Luna lying on the ground again, blood spreading around her body, and heard the echo of Susan's scream, accusing him mercilessly. The images alternated in his mind, forming a cruel mosaic of joy and pain, until remorse took over. What if I had done something different? What if I had stopped it? What if I hadn't given that ride? The questions tormented him, swirling in his mind like an uncontrollable whirlwind. Noah felt the tears burn his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He didn't want his children, on the other side of the glass, to see his weakness. On the other side, his wife, already unable to contain her despair, shouted with all the strength she had left, "Please don't do this. He is innocent. You are killing a good man." Her voice cut through the air like a knife, full of pain and pleas, but found no answer. The guards remained impassive, as if this scene were just another day at work for them. However, her cry echoed in Noah's mind, and he turned his head as much as he could, trying to meet her gaze. He couldn't touch his wife or his children, but he wanted them to know that even at the end, his love for them was immense. "I love you," he murmured, moving his lips slowly, carefully, so she could understand. His wife brought her hands to the glass, tears streaming endlessly as the frightened children tried to hold her and comfort each other. It was a devastating scene, and Noah felt his heart break once again. He wanted to scream back, to apologize for not being there to protect them in the future, but he knew his words wouldn't reach them. All that remained was that last look, laden with remorse, love, and the certainty that, even in the face of his death, his family would be the greatest loss. "We're ready," announced the electric chair operator, his voice resonating with coldness and efficiency. He turned to the prison warden, who nodded firmly, authorizing the procedure. The operator placed his hand on the button, while Noah closed his eyes, trying to control the wave of panic that threatened to explode inside him. His heart was beating so fast that it seemed to be trying to escape his chest, and he felt the sweat trickle down his forehead, mingling with the chilling sensation of the metal helmet. He knew the shock would be quick, but those seconds before seemed to drag on like an eternity, each moment charged with a suffocating expectation. On the other side of the glass, his wife sobbed uncontrollably, their children calling out to him, their voices muffled by the glass barrier. Every sound seemed to blend into a cacophony of pain and despair, but Noah kept his eyes closed, trying to cling to the happy memories he had left. He wanted his last recollection to be of his smiling family, not of that terrifying moment. When the button was pressed, the sound of a high-pitched hum filled the room, and Noah held his breath, waiting for the impact that would end his life. But the impact never came. The hum ceased abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in the air, as if the world itself had stopped to observe what was happening. Noah opened his eyes slowly, confused, as the guards exchanged equally perplexed looks. The operator looked at the panel, frantically adjusting the controls. "The chair failed, sir," he said, his voice trembling slightly, almost as if he didn't believe his own words. The prison warden frowned, visibly irritated. "How is that possible?" "Fix it immediately," he ordered, the tension in his voice revealing his discomfort with the unexpected situation. Noah blinked several times, trying to understand what had happened. He was still alive. He could still feel the oppressive weight of the metal helmet against his head, the straps that held it tightly, restricting every movement, and the cold sweat running down his forehead. His breathing was ragged, almost panting, and the sound of the murmurs around him seemed muffled, as if he was hearing everything through an invisible barrier. He should be dead. The button had been pressed, the process initiated, but somehow he was still there, breathing. It was as if fate itself had stopped, defying all odds and interrupting the natural course of things. Noah didn't know what that meant, but at that moment being alive was all that mattered. On the other side of the glass, his wife brought her hands to her mouth in a gesture of pure astonishment, her eyes wide as she tried to process what was happening. "He's alive," she whispered, almost inaudible, her voice trembling and broken by the tears that refused to stop. Her children, clinging to her, were crying so intensely that their small bodies trembled. But there was something different in their eyes now. Hope. An emotion that seemed to have been ripped from them weeks ago began to seep in again, timid, but undeniable. It was as if a miracle had happened before their eyes, something they could never have imagined on that day that seemed to be the cruelest of all. For Noah, that moment was both a miracle and a curse. He didn't know what would come next, but the feeling of being alive, even if only for one more moment, was so overwhelming that he could barely think clearly. His body was still strapped to the chair, and the helmet still weighed against his head, but he felt every beat of his heart with an intensity that seemed new, almost surreal. The chair, the symbol of his condemnation, had failed at the most critical moment, and he couldn't help but think about the meaning of that. Was it just a technical problem, or was something bigger acting upon him? He didn't know, but he knew that moment was precious. A second chance, however small, had been placed before him. He raised his eyes again, searching for the faces of his family through the glass. His wife's expression was a mixture of shock and relief, but her eyes were fixed on his, conveying a silent message of strength and love. His children, still frightened, were also watching him as if they couldn't believe he was still there, breathing, looking back at them. Noah felt a wave of profound gratitude for that moment, but despair didn't leave him. He knew this wasn't the end of his struggle. It was just a postponement, a brief interval in a battle that seemed impossible to win. Still, he clung to that moment with all his might. As long as he was alive, even if the whole world was against him, there was still a chance, however small, to prove his innocence, to fight for his freedom, to regain everything he had lost. And Noah promised himself that he would not waste that chance. Even with the chains binding his arms, even with the weight of the chair around him, something within him reignited. It wasn't just physical survival. It was the spark of hope, the strength that only someone with everything to lose could find. The failure in Noah's execution changed everything. The chaos in the execution room was quickly muffled by prison protocols, but the tension was palpable. The prison warden, irritated and baffled, ordered that the procedure be temporarily halted. "Return the prisoner to his cell while we sort this out," he said in a firm voice, trying to maintain authority amid the confusion. Noah was removed from the electric chair, his muscles still rigid and his mind trying to process what had happened. The guards led him back to the gloomy corridor, and the sound of his footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. He didn't know what it meant, but the postponement was a small relief amid the nightmare he was living. Back in his cell, Noah sat on the small wooden bench, his mind spinning with chaotic thoughts. He was exhausted emotionally and physically, but a small spark of hope still burned in his chest. Why did the chair fail? Is this a sign? Do I have time to change this? He thought, looking at the bars surrounding him. The vision of his wife and children through the glass was still fresh in his mind, and he knew he couldn't give up, not now. But trapped in that narrow, cold space, he felt powerless, unable to do anything to prove his innocence or fight for the truth. Meanwhile, outside, the fight for Noah continued, but in an unexpected way. Jones, his 13-year-old son, couldn't bear to see his father in that situation. He knew Noah was innocent, felt it in his heart, but didn't know how to prove it. With a determined look and clenched fists, Jones decided to act. He couldn't just sit and wait for things to resolve themselves. "If no one is going to fight for my dad, I will," he thought. Without saying a word to his mother, who was devastated by what had happened, Jones grabbed his backpack and left home with a single goal: to discover the truth. Jones's first stop was at Luna's mother, Susan's house. He knew she had witnessed something that night, and he needed to understand what she really saw. As he approached the door of the modest house, he felt a chill in his stomach, but he knocked firmly, trying to appear more confident than he really was. The door was opened by Susan, who looked at him with surprise and a touch of impatience. "What do you want, boy?" she asked, her voice tired and gruff. Jones took a deep breath, trying not to be intimidated. "I'm Noah Carter's son," he said, his voice firm despite his nervousness. "I need to talk to you about what happened to Luna." Susan rolled her eyes, clearly irritated. "You're just a child. Go home. I don't have time for this," she replied, trying to close the door. But Jones put his foot in the doorway, determined not to give up. "Please, Mum," he insisted. "My dad didn't do it. I know he's innocent. I need to understand why you think he's guilty." Susan sighed, crossing her arms, but ended up leaving the door ajar. "I've already said everything I had to say to the police," she said in an impatient tone. "I heard the shots, and when I went outside, my daughter was dead in front of my door. And who was there? Your dad with his hands covered in blood. It's obvious that it was him." Jones felt his heart sink at those words, but he didn't give up. "But did you see anyone else? Did you hear anything? Anything that could prove it wasn't him?" he asked, trying to find any detail that could help. Susan snorted, clearly irritated by the questions. "Look here, boy, I saw what I saw. Your family should be ashamed of defending a killer. Now go away before I lose my patience," she yelled, taking a threatening step towards him. Jones hesitated, but something in the corner of the room caught his attention. He looked away and saw a pile of money on the table, partially covered by a cloth. Jones's eyes widened. "Where did that money come from?" he asked, pointing at the table. Susan visibly tensed, her face instantly hardening. "That's none of your business," she shouted, quickly moving to block his view. "You have no right to come here and accuse me of anything. Leave now before I call the police." Her reaction was so exaggerated that Jones knew in that moment that something was wrong, but he didn't have a chance to continue. Susan advanced towards him, grabbing his arm and forcefully pushing him out of the house. Stay away from here, and tell your family to stop trying to defend the guilty one, she yelled before slamming the door in his face. Jones stood in front of the house for a few seconds, panting and confused. He knew there was something strange about that situation, something Susan was hiding. Where did that money come from? And why was she so nervous when I asked? He thought as he slowly walked away. Jones's heart was racing, but he felt closer to the truth even if he didn't have all the answers yet. As he walked the streets, he promised himself that he wouldn't stop until he found out what really happened that night. Even if no one else believed him, even if he was just a boy, he knew he needed to keep fighting for his father. Jones continued his relentless search for answers. Despite the closed doors and the contempt he faced, his determination only grew. He couldn't forget Susan's nervous look, the pile of money on the table, and the way she reacted to his questions. Something was wrong and he knew it. As he walked the streets, his mind was buzzing with questions. Why did she get so defensive, and where did that money come from? He needed help, someone who could lead him to a new clue. That's when he spotted a police car parked in front of a cafe. His heart raced. He hesitated for a moment but knew this was his chance. Taking a deep breath, Jones approached the car and saw an officer coming out of the cafe with a hot cup of coffee in his hand. The man looked tired, but his expression was less severe than the other officers Jones had encountered before. "Excuse me, sir," said Jones, trying to sound confident, although his voice was trembling slightly. The officer raised his eyebrows, surprised to see such a young boy addressing him. "What is it, boy? Are you lost?" he asked, taking a sip of his coffee. Jones shook his head. "No, sir, my name is Jones Carter. My dad is Noah Carter, the man who was convicted of Luna Williams' death." The officer stopped immediately, looking at the boy more closely. "Carter, you're his son?" he asked, frowning. "Yes," Jones replied firmly. "And I know he didn't do it. Please listen to me. I need your help." The officer sighed, scratching his head, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Look, kid, I shouldn't be talking to you about this, but I'll be honest. This case has always bothered me," he said, leaning in to speak more quietly. Jones felt a glimmer of hope and moved closer, hanging on every word. "What do you mean?" he asked, eager. The officer looked around to make sure no one was listening before continuing. "Luna's daughter, Susan, had a considerable life insurance policy. And who's the sole beneficiary? Her mother, Susan. I'm not saying that proves anything, but I always thought it was strange that she received such a large amount right after her daughter's death." Jones stood paralyzed for a moment, trying to process what he had just heard. "A life insurance policy," he repeated, incredulous. "And no one investigated that? No one thought that was strange?" The officer shook his head, looking frustrated. "These cases can sometimes be complicated, kid. Her story lined up with the evidence, and your dad was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was convicted too quickly. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but I could never get it out of my head." The officer took a step back, realizing he may have said more than he should. "But don't go doing anything stupid, kid. This isn't stuff for children. Go back home and leave it to the adults," he said, before getting into his car and driving away. Jones stood there on the sidewalk, his heart racing. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. A life insurance policy. Money. That stack of bills at Susan's house now made sense. She's hiding something, he thought, clenching his fists. And no one is seeing it. He knew time was against him, but he couldn't give up now. He needed to confront his mother with what he had discovered and find out what else she knew about the situation. When he got home, the atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. His mother was sitting on the couch, her eyes swollen and red from crying. She looked at him when he came in, but her expression was blank, as if she didn't even have the strength to ask where he'd been. Jones approached her slowly, carefully. "Mom," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I found out something about Luna's mother." Jones's mother sighed, shaking her head. "Jones, please, I can't deal with anything else right now. Your father. His execution has been rescheduled." "It's tomorrow," she said, the words coming out as a whisper, almost inaudible. Jones's world felt like it was crumbling. Tomorrow. They were out of time. His hands started to tremble, but he forced himself to take a deep breath and focus. "Mom, you have to listen to me. Luna's mother had a life insurance policy. She's the beneficiary and she has money hidden at her house. Something is wrong. I know it," he insisted, almost shouting. But his mother shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "Jones, I can't do this right now. We've already lost—" "There's nothing more to be done," she replied, her voice choked. Jones felt a wave of frustration and despair, but he couldn't afford to stop. He knew that if he wanted to save his father, he would have to continue on his own. Night fell like a heavy blanket, and Jones felt adrenaline coursing through his veins as he snuck out the back door of his house. His mother, exhausted and emotionally devastated, was asleep on the couch, unable to keep her eyes open after the hellish day they had faced. Jones took the opportunity to grab his backpack and slip out the door without a sound. He knew his mother would never allow what he was about to do, but he couldn't wait. Tomorrow might be too late, he thought, as he ran through the deserted streets toward the prison where his father was being held. The journey felt longer at night. The darkness amplified the weight of his anxiety, and every shadow cast by a streetlight seemed like an obstacle in his path. He felt his heart pounding fiercely, as if it might burst at any moment, but he kept running. He didn't have a clear plan, only a desperate desire to see his father one last time, to try to understand what was happening, and maybe find a way to help him. "I can't let him die without doing everything I can," he repeated to himself like a mantra that pushed him forward. When he finally reached the prison, Jones was breathless, his face flushed and sweaty from the effort. He looked at the imposing concrete building, illuminated by floodlights that cut through the night, and felt a chill run down his spine. This place looked more like a fortress than a center of justice. He took a deep breath and approached the main gate, where two police officers were casually conversing. Seeing the boy, they exchanged surprised glances before one of them stepped forward. "What are you doing here at this hour, kid?" the officer asked in a gruff voice. Jones swallowed hard but kept his posture firm. "Please, I need to see my father. He's Noah Carter." "He's here," he said, his voice trembling but filled with determination. The officers exchanged another glance, this time with more serious expressions. "Kid, it's late. You know visits aren't allowed now," said the second officer, folding his arms. Jones felt his eyes well up with tears, but he didn't give up. "Please, sir, he's going to be executed tomorrow. I just want to see him one last time. I need to talk to him," he pleaded, his voice breaking in desperation. The officers hesitated. One of them shook his head as if to refuse again, but the other placed a hand on his shoulder and muttered something Jones couldn't hear. After a brief exchange of glances, the first officer sighed and opened the gate. "All right, kid. You've got 10 minutes, but don't cause any trouble," he said before calling a guard to escort Jones to his father's cell. Jones felt a wave of relief mixed with anxiety as he followed the guard down the prison hallways. The sound of his boots echoed off the concrete walls, creating an even more oppressive atmosphere. The boy looked around, trying to memorize every detail, every shadow, as if that could help him understand what was about to happen. Finally, they stopped in front of a cell. The guard looked at Jones for a moment before taking a set of keys from his belt. "Here it is," he said, unlocking the door. But as he pushed the cell door open, something unusual happened. The cell was empty. Jones stood paralyzed, his eyes wide with shock. He looked into the dark interior of the cell, expecting to see his father sitting on the small bench or leaning against the wall. But there was no one there. The bed was perfectly made, the floor clean and the bars intact as if no one had ever been there. What's going on?" Jones asked, his voice almost a whisper. The guard also looked confused, frowning as he looked around. "This can't be right. He was here. He should be here," the man said, stepping into the cell to check, though there was nowhere Noah could be hidden. Jones began to breathe faster, anxiety taking hold of him. "Where's my dad?" "He can't have just disappeared," he exclaimed, his voice rising in pitch. The guard took the radio from his belt and called for backup, the urgency evident in his voice. "Attention, I need immediate confirmation on the location of prisoner Noah Carter. He's not in his cell. Repeat, he's not in his cell," he said, looking around as if expecting to find some clue. The following minutes were a whirlwind of activity. More guards arrived, hurrying down the corridors and checking other cells and records. Jones watched it all with his heart pounding, feeling increasingly lost. He escaped, but how? He was here, he thought, trying to process what was happening. Every step of the guards, every order given over the radio made his mind spin. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The guard who had escorted him approached, visibly shaken. "Kid, I don't know how this happened, but it looks like your dad escaped," he said, though the very idea seemed absurd. Jones felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Part of him was relieved. His dad was no longer facing execution, but another part was filled with fear. If he escaped, that's only going to make things worse. They'll hunt him down. They'll try to kill him, he thought, his mind racing. As the guards continued to scramble frantically, Jones stood in front of the empty cell, trying to understand what it meant. My dad wouldn't just escape without a reason. That's not like him. He must be trying to prove his innocence. Or something happened. Something bigger is going on here, he thought, feeling a growing determination. He looked at the guard again, his eyes shining with a mixture of fear and hope. "I need to help my dad. I need to find out what happened," he said, his voice firm, though his youth still showed through. The guard watched him for a moment, clearly torn between following the rules or listening to the boy. But before he could respond, a voice over the radio interrupted his thoughts. "Confirmed, prisoner Noah Carter is not in any of the prison areas. All units, begin external search immediately," the voice said, laden with tension. The guard sighed and put a hand on Jones's shoulder. "Kid, I don't know how this happened, but you need to go home. Let us handle this," he said, trying to sound reassuring, though his own expression betrayed his uncertainty. But Jones wasn't ready to give up. He knew that if his dad had escaped, it was because he had no other choice. And if Noah was out there, facing a world that already considered him guilty, he would need help. "I'm going to find out what happened, Dad," Jones thought as he left the prison with a heavy heart, but determined to continue his fight for the truth. Dawn brought a mix of determination and anxiety for Jones. He hadn't slept, his mind occupied with trying to piece together the puzzle. Something inside him told him that the key to saving his dad lay at Susan's house, Luna's mother. Though the answers weren't clear, he knew he needed to go back there. With a racing heart and clenched fists, Jones walked to the modest house, but something caught his attention as soon as he arrived. It was no longer the same humble home he had visited before. Outside, Jones saw a parked truck with large boxes, seemingly containing expensive items. He peeked through the window and saw new furniture, luxurious curtains, and even a massive decorative vase that seemed out of place. Your stomach churned when you realized that. Where did all this come from? Didn't she say she was struggling with her daughter's death? How did she manage to buy all these things so quickly? He thought, clenching his jaw. Unable to ignore the suspicion, Jones took a deep breath, took his cell phone out of his pocket and, with trembling hands, called the police. When the line was answered, he quickly explained what was happening, omitting the fact that he was a 13-year-old boy. "You need to come over here. Something's not right," he said, with a determination that surprised even himself. A few minutes later, a police car arrived at the house. Two serious-looking officers got out while Susan, who was at the door, looked at them with a mixture of surprise and nervousness. "What's going on here?" she asked, crossing her arms as the officers approached. Jones, hidden outside, heard one of the officers say, "We received a report and need to ask you some questions, Mrs. Williams. Could you come with us for a moment?" Susan hesitated but eventually agreed. As the officers entered the house, she followed them with tense steps. Inside the house, the officers quickly noticed the luxury items scattered around the living room. One of them frowned and asked, "Ma'am, could you explain where these things came from? This furniture looks new." Susan sighed, trying to keep her composure. "I used part of my daughter's life insurance. It's not a crime, is it? She had insurance and now I'm trying to start my life over," she said, but her voice trembled slightly. The other officer paused and asked, "This life insurance, could you please show us the documents?" Susan went to a drawer, opened it, and took out some papers, handing them to the officers. One of them began to carefully analyze the documents, while the other watched Susan. "Interesting," he said after a few minutes. "You're the sole beneficiary of the life insurance, and it seems to have been created just a few months before your daughter's death. Is that right?" Susan swallowed hard, the nervousness visible on her expression. "Yes, but it doesn't mean anything. I did it because I wanted to secure her future. And then, well, what happened, she replied, tears now streaming down her face. The officers exchanged glances, still suspicious. Williams, we need to be direct. Someone could interpret this as a motive for something bad to happen, said one of the officers, choosing his words carefully. Susan's eyes widened, shocked by the suggestion. How can you say that? I loved my daughter. I would never do anything like that. You have no idea what I'm going through, she shouted, her voice choked with pain. The despair in her words seemed genuine, and the officers began to soften their tone. We're not accusing you, ma'am, just investigating all possibilities. For now, there's no evidence of anything beyond the insurance, which was properly registered. But we need to keep verifying, said one of the officers. Meanwhile, Jones, who had stayed outside, felt frustration growing with every minute that passed. He watched the activity inside the house through the window, seeing the officers talking to Susan, but felt they weren't digging deep enough. They're going to believe her and give up. But there's something wrong here, I know there is, he thought, clenching his fists. Every fiber of his being told him there was more to that story, something no one was seeing. Determined to find some clue, he decided to explore the surroundings of the house on his own, letting tension and suspicion guide his steps. The backyard of the house was unkempt, almost abandoned. The tall, disorderly grass covered parts of the land and hid small objects scattered on the ground, like an old tangled hose, a worn tire, and damp pieces of rotting wood. The air was heavy and humid, and every move Jones made broke the silence of the place with a soft sound of dry leaves under his feet. He looked around, eyes alert, searching for anything that might seem out of place. His heart was pounding hard, more with anticipation of finding something than with fear. With each step he sank deeper into the neglected vegetation, while the house became a little more distant. It was then that he noticed something unusual. Near an old rusty fence partially covered by the tall grass, there was a small pile of crumpled and torn papers. The sight made him stop instantly. The contrast between the still visible white papers, despite the dirt and the neglected surroundings, caught his attention like a beacon in the darkness. "What's that?" he muttered, almost without realizing it, as he slowly knelt on the ground to examine it better. The papers were torn into small pieces, as if someone had made a point of destroying their content before discarding them. Some pieces were so crumpled and dirty that it was difficult even to hold them without feeling the rough and damp texture on your hands. The pile seemed hastily thrown there, mixed with dry leaves and accumulated dust. Jones looked around as if expecting someone to appear at any moment, but the backyard remained empty, engulfed in silence. He leaned closer, trying to see better, but hesitated for a moment before picking up the first piece. His breathing was heavy, his heart racing, as if he knew those papers held something important. While he began carefully gathering the fragments, the tension in his chest increased. Many of the pieces were illegible, with stains or tears that destroyed entire sections. He tried to unfold some of them, but quickly realized that assembling them would be like solving a puzzle. Still, he didn't stop. Something compelled him to continue, as if his intuition was shouting that those papers were more than they appeared. He turned one of the pieces to examine it better, but he couldn't form anything clear. Even without understanding what was in front of him, Jones felt those fragments could contain answers no one else had noticed. With the pieces of paper carefully stored in his backpack, Jones returned to the front of the house, where the police were still questioning Susan. His mind was racing. He had managed to assemble some parts of the fragments, and now had something that seemed like concrete evidence. Someone was asking Susan for money. Among the tears, he could clearly read the phrase, "I want my share." That had made him uneasy, but also made him feel he was closer to the truth. This could be the proof they need, he thought, as he approached the officers. Jones interrupted the conversation with a palpable urgency in his voice. "I found something," he said, quickly opening his backpack and handing the papers to one of the officers. "They were lying in the backyard behind the house. Look at this." The officers took the fragments and began examining them carefully. One of them frowned as he read the partially visible words. "I want my share," he repeated in a low voice as he read. The other officer, more experienced, raised his eyes to Susan, who was now visibly nervous. "Mrs. Williams, can you explain what these papers are? Why were they thrown in the backyard?" he asked in a more severe tone. Susan seemed lost, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. I don't know what those papers are. I've never seen them before," she said, her voice trembling. Tears began streaming down her face, and she raised her hands in a defensive gesture. "Please, you have to believe me. I didn't do anything." "Those papers don't prove anything." She seemed desperate, but the officers didn't seem convinced. "Mrs. Williams, we'll need you to come with us to the station for further questioning," one of the officers said, his voice firm. Susan began sobbing, shaking her head in denial. "I didn't do anything. I loved my daughter. How can you think that of me?" she exclaimed through tears. Still, the officers didn't back down, and one of them called for backup to ensure the transport was done safely. Susan, surrounded by officers, seemed increasingly distressed. As the commotion unfolded, a third officer who was outside received a call over the radio. He listened carefully and then approached his colleagues. "We gained access to a nearby security camera," he said, interrupting the conversation. "It may have captured something on the night of the crime." The news made everyone turn immediately. "Security camera?" asked the officer holding the papers. "That changes everything. Let's see what it shows." The officers quickly organized access to the video. Susan, still crying, continued to deny any involvement, but her nervousness was evident. "You're wasting your time. I've already told you, I'm innocent," she shouted, but no one seemed willing to listen anymore. Jones, beside the officers, felt his heart pounding. "Will we finally find out what happened?" he thought, as the officers turned on the portable monitor they had in the car to access the footage. The recording started rolling, showing the street on the night of the crime. The images were a bit grainy, with some occasional interference, but still clear enough to identify important details. The environment was illuminated by few streetlights, and shadows danced across the walls of nearby houses. The silence in the room was absolute, with all eyes fixed on the monitor. The officers fast-forwarded the video to the approximate time of the incident, as stated in the initial report. The tension was almost suffocating. Each second that passed seemed like a tick on the clock of truth. Jones held his breath, his heart beating so hard he could barely hear anything else. His eyes were fixed on the screen, while the officers, with serious expressions, remained attentive. Susan, on the other hand, looked petrified, her eyes welling up with tears as she nervously bit her lips. Suddenly, something appeared on the screen. The camera showed the front of Susan's house, the gate with rusty hinges and the deserted sidewalk. Then Luna appeared walking towards the door, looking around as if she were nervous. Soon after, Noah's car parked across the street. Jones's anxiety increased as he saw his father get out of the vehicle. Noah seemed calm, going to meet Luna, who seemed about to say something. The two stood close to the door, and by their body language it was evident that they were having a common routine conversation. But then something happened that no one expected. A hooded figure emerged from the shadows beside the house, moving quickly. The hooded man was holding something in one of his hands, and before any reaction could happen, he drew a gun and fired without hesitation. The camera captured the moment when the flash of the shot lit up the scene. The impact made Luna fall to the ground, her body collapsing heavily against the concrete. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the recording, even with the muffled audio. Noah, taken by shock, immediately ran to her, as he had always described. He knelt by Luna's side, trying to stop the blood that was beginning to spread on the floor, his hands visibly desperate. The images clearly showed his attempt to save her, the frantic movements of someone in panic. While Noah tried to help her, the hooded figure fled, running to the other side of the street, disappearing into the darkness. The camera managed to capture part of the assailant's path, but he quickly went out of the lens range. The recording then focused back on Noah, who seemed to be shouting something without taking his eyes off Luna. His hands, stained red, were not those of a murderer, but of someone desperately trying to save a life. Soon after, Susan appeared at the door, her movements quick and agitated. The images clearly showed that she was shouting something, but there was not enough audio to capture her words. However, it was evident that Noah was completely stunned. Without any weapon in his hands or aggressive attitude, he seemed lost, overwhelmed by the horror of the situation, while Susan gestured to him, pointing with an expression of panic. The officers remained silent for several seconds after the recording ended. The impact of those images was undeniable. Noah had been telling the truth all along. He was not the culprit. The evidence was there, clear and indisputable. Jones felt his eyes fill with tears as he processed what he had just seen. It was a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because the truth was finally coming to light. Sadness because his father had gone through so much suffering being wrongly accused. My father was telling the truth, he thought, as a solitary tear ran down his face. His heart was heavy, but now it pulsed with renewed hope. One of the officers sighed, shaking his head with an expression of contained frustration, and then looked directly at Susan. Her face, once filled with indignation and nervousness, now seemed empty, as if the vitality had been completely drained from her. Her eyes were wide, but no longer conveyed that defensive anger. They were eyes that reflected confusion, fear, and a kind of despair that she could not hide. Her lips trembled slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but could not find the words. The officer studied her for a few more seconds before turning to Jones, the boy who was still standing by the monitor, fixing his gaze on the screen as if searching for answers the camera had not been able to capture. "It seems someone was trying to frame your father," the officer said to Jones, in a grave voice laden with seriousness. He frowned as he spoke, as if he were not only communicating a thought, but also questioning himself about what that meant. But who? The question hung in the air like a charged, dense cloud that no one knew how to disperse. Susan, upon hearing this, shook her head almost imperceptibly, as if she were trying to deny something to herself, but did not have the courage to utter a single word. Jones remained silent. He did not look away from the monitor screen, even after the recording had ended, and the image had frozen on the last frame, showing his father kneeling beside Luna. The scene seemed etched in his mind, as if he were watching it repeatedly. Every detail was there. Noah's despair, the hooded man's escape, Susan's horrified expression at the door. But even with all this evidence, Jones knew there were still missing pieces in this puzzle. Who was the hooded man? Why had they framed his father? And most importantly, how had Luna become the target of something so cruel? The police officers started to converse among themselves, discussing the next steps and analyzing the information they had at hand. The tension in the air was almost palpable, with every word being carefully measured. "We need to review these images in more detail," said one of them, while the other nodded. "And Susan, we need you to accompany us to the station to give a formal statement." The officer's tone was not one of accusation, but the authority in his voice made it clear that there was no room for resistance. Meanwhile, Jones remained motionless. His hands were clenched into fists, his shoulders tense. He felt the weight of everything that had happened in the past few weeks, but at the same time, there was a spark of hope lit within him. For the first time, he could see a light at the end of the tunnel. The truth, which seemed so unattainable, was finally starting to emerge. His father was innocent, and now there was evidence to support that. But at the same time, he knew that this was just the beginning. The camera had revealed enough to exonerate Noah, but it still left many questions unanswered. Who was the real culprit, and why had Luna been killed? Susan, meanwhile, began to sob. Tears streamed down her face, but they were different from the earlier ones. It wasn't the defensive crying of someone who felt cornered, but rather of someone who was completely lost. "I don't know. I don't know anything," she muttered, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was weak, almost inaudible, but laden with genuine pain. "I loved my daughter. You have to believe me. I don't know why this is happening." She repeated these phrases, as if trying to convince herself more than others. Jones finally looked away from the monitor and at her. For a moment, he felt something akin to compassion, but it was quickly overshadowed by distrust. He knew Susan was hiding something, even if it was out of fear or ignorance. "You don't know anything?" he asked, his voice firmer than he thought he was capable of. "Then why did you seem so nervous about those papers in the backyard? And why would someone be asking you for money? If you have nothing to hide, then help figure out who did this." Jones's tone made Susan shudder. She stared at him for a few seconds, as if trying to find the strength to respond, but nothing came out of her mouth. The officers observed the interaction in silence, but their looks showed that they too were waiting for some explanation from her. While Susan remained silent, Jones drifted back into his thoughts. He was analyzing everything he had seen, trying to piece it all together. The camera footage had shown the hooded figures escape, but it didn't reveal their identity. The note found in the backyard indicated that someone else was involved, someone who could have had financial motives for committing the crime. And as much as Susan claimed innocence, Her behavior and the fact that she was the beneficiary of Luna's life insurance policy still cast a shadow of doubt. The minutes that followed were filled with murmurs from the officers and the muffled sound of Susan's sobs. Jones, however, was determined. He knew this wasn't the end. Something bigger was hidden, something that could completely change the course of things, and even though he was only a 13-year-old boy, he was determined to keep going until the whole truth was revealed. After all, now he had something he didn't have before: hope, and that was all he needed to keep fighting. As the officers were still discussing the evidence, and Susan remained seated in silence, enveloped in a mix of tears and confusion, the front door was forcefully opened. Another officer rushed in, holding a tablet in his hands. His expression was grave, and the already tense atmosphere seemed to grow even heavier. "I got something," he announced, drawing everyone's attention in the room. The group instantly fell silent, all eyes turning towards the officer, who now held the tablet as if it were a vital fragment of a truth previously hidden. "It's a phone recording," the officer explained as he connected the device to a portable speaker he had brought along. "We gained access to Susan's phone records, and we found this specific call. You need to hear this." Susan slowly raised her head, her face as pale as a ghost, while the officers gathered around the device, and Jones looked on with wide eyes, feeling his heart pounding. "I don't know what call you're talking about," said Susan, her voice weak but clearly laced with nervousness. The officer ignored her and pressed play. A heavy silence fell over the room, as if time had stopped. Then, the recording began. A man's rough, direct voice sounded first. "You're hesitating too much. If you want the money, you need to do this soon." There was a brief pause, and then a female voice responded, more muffled but clearly recognizable. It was Susan. I don't know. This is wrong. I don't know if I can do this." Her voice was trembling, but there was no denying it was her. The room seemed to freeze as the words continued. "Do you want the money or not? All you have to do is make sure she's no longer around. You already have the insurance. You just need to do your part," the male voice insisted, now firmer, almost impatient. Susan responded, but her voice was full of hesitation. I'll think about it. I need time." The recording ended, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. Everyone present was paralyzed, processing what they had just heard. Susan, who was already nervous, descended into a state of pure panic. This doesn't mean anything. You don't understand the context. This recording doesn't prove I did anything," she shouted desperately, looking around for support but finding none. The officers' faces remained stern, and their looks were now utterly incredulous. "Mrs. Williams," said one of the officers, his voice cold and authoritative, "this recording clearly suggests you were considering something criminal regarding your daughter, and you said you needed time. We now have more than enough reason to arrest you." He began to approach Susan, placing the handcuffs on the table with a sound that seemed to echo through the room. "No, I didn't do this. It wasn't me. I loved my daughter," Susan screamed, her voice filled with desperation. She began to cry uncontrollably, but there was no one left who believed her. The officers firmly lifted her from her chair as she continued to protest, her sobs echoing through the house. "You're making a mistake. I'm innocent," she repeated, but her words sounded empty, having no impact in the face of the devastating evidence. Jones watched it all unfold with a mixture of shock and sadness. He knew the truth was coming to light, but he had never imagined Susan could be so directly involved. How could someone even think of doing that to their own daughter, he thought, trying to process everything he had just heard. While there was relief in knowing his father was closer to being cleared, the cruelty of the situation was hard to bear. As Susan was escorted out by the officers to the police car, Jones approached one of the officers. "Does this mean my dad will be released, right?" he asked, his voice filled with hope and anxiety. The officer nodded, though his expression was grave. "We'll work on ensuring justice is served. We now have enough evidence to reopen your father's case and review his conviction. But we still need to investigate further about who the man on the recording was." Jones looked at the departing police car, carrying Susan to the station. The truth was finally coming to light, but he knew there were still unanswered questions. Who was the man on the call? Why was he so involved? And above all, what else could be hidden in the shadows of this cruel plot? The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time Jones felt they were on the right path to saving his father and uncovering the whole truth. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into 2 full months. Despite all the efforts of the police to find Noah after his mysterious escape, no concrete clues had surfaced. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth. During this time, Jones saw his hope, which was once an intense flame, begin to weaken. The absence of his father, now declared innocent, became a constant pain that accompanied him at every moment of the day. Even with Susan's imprisonment and the revelation of the cruel plan that took Luna's life, the void left by Noah seemed impossible to fill. Jones spent long nights awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining where his father could be. Is he okay? Is he afraid, or has he given up on everything? The last question always made him shudder. He tried to push away the darkest thoughts, but the prolonged absence began to weigh on his heart. His mother was also visibly shaken, though she tried to remain strong for him. The home that was once filled with laughter and moments of comfort now seemed plunged into an oppressive silence. One night, Jones was sitting on the couch holding his phone with trembling hands. It was late and he was trying to distract his mind by watching something on television, but the screen seemed just a blur as his head was elsewhere. Suddenly, the sound of the phone broke the silence. He almost dropped the device, so unexpected was the ring. He looked at the screen, but the number was unknown. His heart raced. Who could be calling at that hour? Hesitant but taken by a strange sense of urgency, he answered. "Hello?" said Jones, his voice cautious, almost whispering. For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Only the distant sound of heavy breathing could be heard. "Hello?" he repeated, now louder, anxiety starting to take over. Then a voice he would recognize anywhere came through the line. "Jones, it's Dad." Jones's hand gripped the phone so tightly that his fingers began to hurt. "Dad? Is that you? Where are you? What's happening?" His voice was full of emotion, a mixture of relief and despair. He heard the sound of heavy breathing on the other side again, and then Noah's faint voice continued. "Son, I need help. They're after me. I don't know how long I have, but I need you to trust me. I'll send something. Promise me you'll help me." Jones felt his heart racing, the words echoing in his mind. "They're after you." Who were they? Why couldn't Noah just come home now that he had been proven innocent? "Dad, where are you? I'll come to you right now. Tell me," he insisted, his voice trembling. But Noah did not respond immediately. A muffled sound as if something had been dropped was heard in the background. "Son, trust me, I love you, and I'm sorry," said Noah before the call was abruptly cut off. Jones stood still, the phone still pressed against his ear, as if expecting the connection to be restored. The silence on the other end seemed deafening. "Dad? Dad?" he shouted, but there was no one else on the line. He felt tears rolling down his face as his heart pounded with fear and confusion. What was happening? Who was after his father? And why couldn't he just come back now that his innocence had been proven? He looked at the phone again, trying to call back, but the number seemed to no longer exist. It was as if Noah had made the call from some isolated place or a disposable device. Jones felt a mixture of relief and panic. Knowing his father was alive brought a spark of hope, but the plea for help in his voice was something Jones would never forget. He knew he needed to act quickly. There was no time for doubt or hesitation. He needed to help his father before it was too late. Jones wiped away the tears rising quickly. His body was taken over by a new determination. He didn't know where to start, but he knew he would do whatever it took to find Noah and bring him home. "I'll save you, Dad," he said out loud, as a promise to himself and the man who had always believed in him. The battle was far from over, but Jones was more ready than ever to face it. As soon as he hung up the phone, Jones ran to the room where his mother was. "Mom, Dad called. He's alive," he shouted, the words tumbling out in emotion. Jones' mother looked at him, confused and incredulous. "What are you saying, Jones?" "How did he call?" she asked, but Jones wasted no time explaining. He picked up the phone and quickly dialed the police number. "I need to speak with the detective investigating my father's case," he said, urgency in his voice. After a few minutes of anxious waiting, he finally managed to pass the information on to the responsible detective. He told about the call and his father's voice asking for help, detailing what he had heard. He said he's being held by someone but didn't give details. You need to trace that call, Jones pleaded. The detective, though surprised by the sudden turn of events, replied firmly, "We'll take care of it, Jones. Let us trace the number. It may take a few hours, but we'll do our best." Meanwhile, Noah was in an unknown location, trapped in a dark room. The space was small and dimly lit, with concrete walls and only a small window covered by bars. Noah was sitting on an old chair, his hands tied and visible marks of fatigue on his face. In front of him, an imposing-looking man with a cold expression paced back and forth. "You think you're going to get out of here alive?" the man said with a tone of contempt. "You should have kept quiet, Carter. All of this could have ended for you in that prison, but now you've forced me to act." Noah looked at him with determination, despite his debilitated condition. "I won't stop until the truth is known. You can't hide this forever," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. The man laughed, a laugh loaded with sarcasm. "The truth? You think anyone cares about the truth? The world believes what I say, and you're just a stone in my path, but don't worry, I'll take care of that soon." The man approached Noah, leaning in to be face to face with him. "In the meantime, enjoy your time here. You have nowhere to run. And no one's going to find you," he said with a cruel smile before leaving the room, slamming the door hard. Noah closed his eyes, trying to breathe deeply and stay calm. He knew he needed strength to resist, but the fatigue and humiliation were starting to weigh on him. He could only hope that somehow someone would come to his aid. Meanwhile, at the police station, the officers finally managed to trace the origin of the call. "We got a signal," announced one of the technicians. "It seems to have come from an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It's a deactivated industrial area." The detective wasted no time. He organized a team and called Jones and his mother. "We found the location. We're on our way. Stay where you are and leave this to us," he said, but Jones didn't want to stay put. "I want to go with you. It's my dad," he insisted, but the detective was firm. "No, Jones, it's dangerous. Trust us." Meanwhile, Noah was sitting on an old, uncomfortable metal chair, his hands tied behind his back with ropes that cut into his skin with every movement. The environment around him was gloomy, dimly lit by a slowly swaying lamp that cast grotesque shadows on the concrete walls. The air was heavy, humid, and permeated with the smell of rust and mold. He was exhausted, hungry, his body muscles aching from spending hours in the same position. The silence was broken only by the occasional sound of dripping from somewhere in the ceiling, like a somber metronome marking time. Suddenly the room door was opened with a jarring creak. The figure of a large, imposing man entered, slamming the door shut. He had his face partially covered by a black mask that hid his features, but his eyes gleamed with a coldness that made Noah's heart race. In his hands, the man held a wooden staff, which he slowly twirled like a toy. "So, Noah," he began with a tone laden with contempt, "how's it feel to be at the bottom of the pit? Not as comfortable as your office, is it?" Noah didn't respond. He knew that anything he said would be used against him. His silence seemed to further irritate the man who approached, slamming the staff forcefully on the ground. "Ah, so now you're the quiet type. Interesting. Because you sounded quite talkative when you were trying to save your skin in prison," the man said, leaning in to look Noah directly in the eye. "But let me tell you something, Noah. You're not getting out of here. No matter what you think, no matter what you hope for, no one's going to save you." The man began pacing in circles around Noah, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the small room. "You think you're special? That you deserve to live while other people die? Spare me," he continued with a sardonic laugh. "You were only put in this position because you wanted to play the hero. If you had just kept quiet and accepted what you were given, we wouldn't be here. But no, you had to be the good man, the exemplary father, didn't you? Pathetic." Noah raised his eyes, meeting the man's gaze even though his body was weak and trembling with fatigue. "You can say whatever you want," he muttered, his voice hoarse, "but I'm not going to stop fighting. You don't know what it means to be a father, to protect your family. You can humiliate me, but you won't break that inside me." The man stopped abruptly, twirling the stick in one of his hands before placing it under Noah's chin, forcing him to raise his head. "Really?" he said, with a low, cruel laugh. "You speak as if you have a choice, as if you have any control here. Let me explain something to you, Noah. I'm the only one in control. I decide if you eat, if you drink, if you live or die." He slowly removed the stick, leaving a reddish mark on Noah's chin, and walked away. The man went to a small table in the corner of the room and picked up a water bottle. He opened it and took a long sip, making an exaggerated sound of satisfaction before turning to Noah again. "Are you thirsty, Noah?" he asked in an almost mocking tone. "I bet you are." He approached and held the bottle close to Noah's face, tilting it slightly so that a few drops fell on his parched lips. Noah tried not to react, but his body betrayed him, and he involuntarily moved his lips to capture the moisture. The man laughed, quickly pulling the bottle away. "Look at you, a big man, reduced to this. What a pathetic sight." He poured the water onto the floor right at Noah's feet and resumed pacing in circles. "You know, I actually like you, Carter. You have courage, but courage won't get you anywhere. Not here. Here you're just another desperate man with no one to help you." He leaned in again, whispering into Noah's ear, "And I'll make sure you suffer every second of it." Despite the physical pain and cruel words weighing on his mind, Noah kept his gaze fixed, determination burning in his chest. He knew the man wanted to break him, but he wouldn't give him that pleasure. "So you can hurt me," Noah said, his voice trembling but firm, "but you'll never take away the truth, and in the end it will destroy you." The man stepped back, studying Noah for a moment, before letting out a dry laugh. "Really? We'll see about that, Carter. We'll see." He left the room, leaving Noah alone again with the sound of the heavy door being locked behind him. Noah took a deep breath, trying to gather strength, while his mind clung to the only thing that kept him alive, the hope of seeing his son and family again. The police force mobilized quickly, heading to the reported location. The warehouse was large, with rusted walls and broken windows. Outside, the police surrounded the area, moving silently to avoid alerting anyone inside. "We need to enter carefully," said the detective, as he signaled to his colleagues. They formed a perimeter around the warehouse, positioning themselves strategically to block any attempt to escape. Inside the warehouse, Noah was alone, trying to think of a way to free himself. He heard footsteps echoing down the hallway, indicating the man was returning. His heart raced, but before the door could be opened, a distant sound caught both of their attention. It was the sound of approaching cars, followed by a muffled noise, perhaps someone moving outside. The environment inside the warehouse was a mix of tension and chaos. As the police team stormed the place in a coordinated manner, 3 officers managed to access the floor where Noah was being held. They kicked the door open, aiming their guns into the dimly lit room. "Police, drop your weapon and surrender," shouted one of the officers, his firm voice echoing off the concrete walls. But before they could move, the man holding Noah captive suddenly appeared, gripping Noah tightly from the front, with a gun pointed at his head. "Don't take another step," the man shouted, his voice laced with anger and desperation. Noah was clearly debilitated, his face pale and his body nearly powerless. His hands were tied in front and he staggered, trying to keep his balance as the man pulled him closer, using him as a human shield. "If anyone shoots, he dies. Do you understand? I'm in control here." The man's tone was unsteady, but laden with determination. The 3 officers immediately stopped, assessing the situation cautiously. All kept their guns trained, but none dared move. The team leader stepped forward, raising his hand in a peaceful gesture. "Easy. No one is going to shoot. We'll resolve this without anyone getting hurt," he said, trying to buy time. He looked directly at the man, keeping his voice firm but non-provocative. "You don't have to do this. Release the hostage and we can negotiate." The man laughed, but his laughter was laced with nervousness. "Negotiate? You think I'm an idiot? I know how this works. If I let him go, I'm dead." He pulled Noah closer, pressing the gun against his head. Noah groaned in pain but said nothing. He knew any word could make the situation worse. "I want out of here. I'll get out of here." "You're going to let me go or he dies now," the man shouted, his eyes darting frantically between the officers. The police team leader remained calm, though the tension was clear in his stance. "Okay, we can do that. No one is going to stop you from leaving, but you need to give us something in return. Leave the hostage here and we'll guarantee your safety," he said, trying to defuse the situation with words. But the man shook his head furiously. "You think I'm going to believe that? He's coming with me. I'll use him to make sure no one follows me. If you try anything, you know what happens." The officers exchanged quick glances, trying to decide how to proceed. Any wrong move could endanger Noah, and the leader knew the priority was to ensure his safety. He took a step back, signaling for the other two officers to lower their guns slightly. "All right, we'll do it your way. You can leave with him. But please keep calm. We don't want this to end badly," he said, his voice controlled. The man started moving toward the exit, still holding Noah firmly as a shield. He kept his eyes on the officers, watching for any suspicious move. The officers, in turn, remained vigilant, following every step. "I'm getting out of this place, and none of you are going to follow me. Understood?" he said, his voice loud and shaky. The team leader nodded. "Understood. No one will follow you," he said, trying to convey reassurance. Noah, despite his condition, tried to speak, but the man pulled him even tighter, silencing him. "Shut up! Don't say a word!" he shouted, pushing Noah toward the door. When they reached the warehouse exit, the man paused for a moment, surveying the outside. The area was surrounded with police cars positioned strategically, but no one made aggressive moves. Everything was quiet, except for the sound of the man's steps and Noah's groans. Finally, the man reached the main door, still using Noah as a shield. He looked at the officers one last time. "Now I'm going to release him. But if anyone tries to follow me or shoot, you'll regret it," he said, before shoving Noah forward with force. Noah stumbled and fell to the ground, exhausted, as the man ran out of the warehouse, trying to reach one of the nearby vehicles. The officers reacted immediately. Two of them ran to assist Noah, while the rest initiated a chase after the man. Noah was quickly untied and taken to a safe place. He was injured but alive, and looked at the officers with gratitude. "Thank you," he muttered before passing out from exhaustion. Meanwhile, the man was pursued by the officers, and the sound of sirens began echoing through the area, indicating he wouldn't get far. The operation had been a success, and Noah was finally safe. The chaos outside the warehouse was palpable. The sound of sirens echoed through the area, and the officers were in frantic pursuit of the fleeing man. He ran desperately, looking back every few steps, clutching the gun tightly as he tried to escape. His steps were hurried but erratic, showing the desperation of someone who knew he was cornered. Adrenaline seemed to be his only strength, but he didn't know that. As he turned the corner of the warehouse, a surprise awaited him. Jones, who had followed secretly in one of the police cars, was lying in wait. He had hidden himself near the warehouse's exit, watching everything with keen eyes. When he saw the man running toward him, Jones realized this was his chance. His heart pounded like a drum, but he didn't hesitate. With a swift move, he stuck his foot out at the precise moment the man ran past. The impact was immediate. The man violently tripped, losing his balance and crashing hard to the ground, while the gun slipped from his hands and slid away. The impact of the fall was so strong that the man groaned in pain, trying to get up. But the seconds he lost were enough for the police to reach him. "Stay on the ground! Don't move!" shouted one of the officers, while pointing his gun at him. Another officer quickly handcuffed the man, immobilizing him before he could react. The situation was brought under control in a matter of seconds, but the moment seemed to stretch like an eternity for Jones, who was still standing, breathless, trying to understand what he had just done. The police turned to Jones, surprised. "Did you do that?" one of them asked, with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Jones nodded slowly, still breathing deeply. "I couldn't let him escape," he said, his voice trembling but full of determination. "He hurt my dad, and he's not going to hurt anyone else." The handcuffed man looked at Jones with hatred in his eyes but said nothing. He knew he was defeated. The officers lifted him up, taking him to a nearby police car. As he was placed in the back seat, the detective in charge of the operation looked at Jones with a satisfied smile. "You've got guts, kid. I don't know if that was reckless or genius, but you helped close this case," he said, placing a hand on Jones's shoulder. "Your dad's going to be proud." Noah, who had been taken to a safe place after being rescued, was informed of the capture. Even still weak, he insisted on seeing Jones. When they were finally reunited, Noah hugged his son tightly, tears streaming down his face. "I knew you were special, Jones. You never gave up on me, even when the whole world seemed to have given up," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Jones, in turn, felt the same wave of relief and pride. "I just did what you taught me, Dad. Never give up on the ones we love. Days later, the man's trial was held. All the evidence was against him. The phone recording, Noah's testimony, and now his escape attempt. During the trial, he tried to justify himself, but the words sounded hollow. The truth was clear to everyone, and he was found guilty of kidnapping, attempted homicide, and conspiracy in the murder of Luna. The sentence was severe, and he was taken away to serve a life sentence, closing a chapter of suffering for Noah and his family. Noah and Jones, now together again, watched as justice was served. There were no more doubts, no more accusations, nor shadows of the past to haunt them. They had been through hell but came out stronger and more united on the other side. The truth had finally triumphed, and life, though scarred by what they had endured, could finally move forward. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial, with people occupying every available seat and many others waiting outside. The case had gained notoriety after the capture of the man who had kept Noah captive, and the revelation that he and Susan were linked to Luna's murder only increased public interest. Noah was present in court, sitting beside Jones and his wife. He had regained some of his physical strength, but the emotional weight was still evident on his face. Yet on that day, he had something he hadn't felt in months: hope. The man, identified as Marcos Castillo, was called to testify. Handcuffed and with a cold expression, he was led to the witness stand. The murmurs in the room ceased as he began to speak. Under the pressure of the evidence and the threat of an even harsher sentence, Marcos finally broke his silence. "I was paid," he began, his voice hoarse but audible enough to be heard by everyone. "I was hired to kill Luna Williams. It was a job. Simple as that." The statement made the room explode in shocked murmurs. The judge banged his gavel several times to restore order. "Silence in the courtroom," he said firmly. Noah, sitting in the back, felt his heart race. Finally, the truth was coming out. Jones, by his side, squeezed his father's hand tightly, feeling the same wave of relief and indignation. Marcos continued. "I didn't know her. I had never seen that girl before. The request came directly from her mother, Susan Williams. She wanted me to kill her so she could get the life insurance money." He paused, looking at the floor before finishing. "She said she needed the money, and that her daughter was the obstacle. I just followed orders." Susan, sitting beside her lawyer, began shaking her head frantically, her hands gripping the arms of the chair tightly, as if trying to hold on to her own sanity. "That's a lie. He's making all this up to save himself," she shouted, abruptly standing up, her voice echoing through the courtroom. Her tone was desperate, filled with indignation, but also with a panic that was impossible to disguise. Her eyes were wide, and her posture showed she was losing control. The judge banged his gavel hard, the sound reverberating through the crowded room. "Mrs. Williams, sit down and remain silent. You'll have your chance to speak, but for now, be quiet," he said with a firmness that made Susan hesitate for a moment before sitting back down. The panic, however, was evident in every move she made, in every expression that crossed her face. While the prosecution continued to present the evidence corroborating Marcos's devastating testimony. The phone recording, played again for the jurors, made Susan's conspiratorial tone clear. On the call, her hesitation was not that of an innocent person, but of someone trying to justify something morally indefensible. The bank records were displayed on the courtroom screen, showing significant transfers to an account linked to Marcos, and the prosecutors highlighted how these deposits coincided with the dates prior to Luna's murder. The last piece was presented: text messages recovered from Marcos's cell phone, where Susan discussed details of the plan with him, trying to ensure that everything was done in a clean manner to avoid suspicion. The jurors, previously divided in their expressions, now seemed unified in a mixture of shock and revulsion. Some exchanged discreet glances, while others simply shook their heads in disbelief. With each new piece of evidence, Susan seemed to sink further into her chair, her face now as white as paper. She looked at the lawyer by her side, but he too was speechless, aware that the evidence was practically impossible to refute. When Susan was called to the witness stand, the tension in the courtroom reached its peak. The sound of murmurs ceased completely, and the atmosphere seemed suffocating. She rose hesitantly, adjusting her clothes with trembling hands, as if trying to control her appearance could somehow alleviate the gravity of the situation. As she sat down, she avoided looking at the jurors or Noah, who watched her with a firm but not angry expression. "I would never do that to my daughter. He's lying to get a lighter sentence," she said, her voice trembling as she tried to defend herself. The desperation was palpable in every word, but her claims sounded empty and disconnected from reality. The jurors remained impassive, as if their minds had already been made up before she even spoke. The prosecution then refuted each of her claims, with the evidence already presented, dismantling any defense she tried to construct. When the trial came to an end, the courtroom was steeped in a tense silence of expectation. The judge asked the jurors to announce their verdict. The room held its breath as the jury representative stood up. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Susan Williams, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud," he declared. The silence was broken by low murmurs, which intensified when he continued. "And we find Marcos Castillo guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping." The judge banged the gavel, confirming the sentences of life in prison without the possibility of parole for both. Noah, seated in the back, felt a wave of relief so intense that it seemed to lift a monumental weight from his shoulders. The accusations that had crushed his life were finally undone. When the judge declared his innocence, Noah closed his eyes and let out a deep sigh, feeling for the first time in months that he could truly breathe. He turned to Jones, who hugged him tightly, tears streaming down the boy's face. His wife beside them cried tears of relief, holding Noah's hand as if she would never let go again. As Susan was escorted out of the courtroom, handcuffed and surrounded by guards, she did not say a word. Her gaze was vacant, and her face bore an expression of absolute emptiness. Noah watched the scene for a moment, but not with hatred or satisfaction. What he felt was sadness. Sadness for Luna, for Susan's shattered family, and for everything that had happened. But he knew he couldn't change the past. Justice had been served, and that was what mattered now. "None of this brings Luna back," he muttered to himself before turning to Jones and his wife. "But we can move forward, together." Outside the courthouse, journalists and onlookers surrounded the entrance, taking pictures and asking questions, as Noah and his family emerged hand in hand. But he ignored all the commotion. For him, what really mattered was the fact that they were together again. The truth had prevailed, and although the scars of that experience would remain, Noah knew they had the strength to face them. A new chapter was beginning for his family, and this time it would be marked by peace and unity. The courtroom was empty now, but the sense of relief and justice still lingered in the air as Noah left hand in hand with Jones and his wife. The sun shone brightly outside, as if even the universe was celebrating the closure of such a painful story. Journalists shouted questions, cameras flashed incessantly, but none of it mattered to Noah. He looked at his family by his side and smiled, the first genuine smile he had given in months. "We're free of this," he said, squeezing Jones's hand tightly. Finally, the days that followed were ones of rebuilding. The house that once seemed so empty and silent was now filled with laughter and conversations, as Noah and his family worked together to overcome the challenges they had faced. Jones, with his curiosity and courage, became a source of inspiration for Noah. "You were the hero of this story, son," Noah said one night as they talked on the porch. "If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here now." Jones smiled shyly, but his eyes shone with pride. "I just wanted the truth to be known, Dad. I knew you were innocent." Meanwhile, the community, which had once looked at them with suspicion, began to change. Neighbors and acquaintances approached, apologizing for having doubted Noah and offering support to the family. Noah, although still carrying the emotional scars of everything he had been through, felt grateful for the chance to start over. He decided that he would use his experience to help others. "If I could survive this, I can help others who also need justice," he told his wife, who supported him every step of the way. Months later, Noah began giving talks at schools and community events, sharing his story to inspire and warn people about the dangers of hasty judgments. Jones, always by his father's side, became a central figure in these talks, proving that the courage and determination of a 13-year-old boy can change lives. "The truth always comes out, even when it seems impossible," he would tell the audience, receiving warm applause. The family also began to appreciate even more the small moments together, as if each shared second were a gift. Walks in the park became weekly rituals, where Jones ran across the lawns while Noah and his wife watched with tranquil smiles, hands intertwined as at the beginning of their relationship. Nights watching movies on the couch, eating popcorn and laughing at silly jokes, became precious moments that warmed everyone's hearts. And home dinners, once simple, were now celebrations. Noah made a point of cooking every now and then, putting affection into each dish he prepared, while Jones talked about his day with youthful enthusiasm. They had learned to value what truly mattered, each other's presence. Every day Noah found a way to tell how much he loved his wife and son. He left notes scattered around the house, writing phrases like, "Thank you for everything you do for us," or "I'm lucky to have you as my family." These simple but meaningful gestures became part of their routine, and each one was received with emotional smiles. Jones, in turn, felt closer to his father than ever before. He admired Noah's strength, not only for overcoming so many adversities, but also for keeping his heart full of love and compassion even when the world seemed to crumble around him. A year later, on a sunny afternoon, Noah Jones and his wife were sitting on the grass of a park, surrounded by the joyful sound of playing children and the singing of birds. Jones's soccer game was the center of attention that day. Now 14 years old, he displayed a determination and enthusiasm that made Noah and his wife vibrate with every pass, every kick. "Go, Jones, we're with you," Noah shouted, with an energy that seemed to infect the other parents around. Hearing the encouraging shouts, Jones ran even faster, driven by his family's unconditional support. When Jones scored a goal, he raised his arms in celebration, running to hug his friends. Noah watched that scene with a broad smile, his heart overflowing with pride. He turned to his wife and gently squeezed her hand, saying, "This is our future." His voice was low but filled with meaning. A future full of joy, unity, and hope. She nodded, her eyes shining with tears that were not of sadness but of pure happiness. For them, this was the ultimate victory. At the end of the day, as they walked home together, the sky began to fill with stars. Noah stopped for a moment, holding his wife and Jones by the shoulders. He looked at both of them as if he wanted to engrave that moment in his memory forever. "Thank you for never giving up on me," he said, his voice choked with emotion. His wife hugged him tightly, murmuring in response, "We would never give up, Noah. You're our family." Jones, looking at his father with admiration, added, "You taught us to fight for what's right, Dad. We just followed your example." Noah smiled at Jones's words, but they also made a tear roll down his face. He couldn't express how much that meant to him. Noah took a deep breath, allowing himself a moment to contemplate the starry sky above them. For the first time in a long time, he felt that everything was exactly as it should be. The past, though filled with pain and injustice, had been left behind. It was simply that, the past. The present was overflowing with love and gratitude, and the future was like a blank book, waiting to be filled with new happy memories. And in that moment, Noah knew that no matter what fate had in store, they would face it all together as a family. He squeezed Jones's and his wife's shoulders, and together they followed the path back home, their hearts filled with hope. Justice had been served, and life was giving them a new chance at happiness. If Noah and Jones's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and check out the story appearing on the screen now, specially chosen for you. See you soon.